Colonization. The air was thin, the land unforgiving, and the people who lived here had to fight for every breath, every meal, and every scrap of safety they could find. Jackson Creed had made a name for himself in these parts. He was a bounty hunter, a mercenary, a cowboy with no care for rules and certainly no interest in anyone's feelings. His job was simple: take the money, do the job, and move on to the next one. Nothing mattered to him, except survival. Jackson had been hired for a job unlike any other. A woman named Aurora Calloway had appeared on his radar, and his orders were clear. Take her to the distant colony of Glissar on the far side of the frontier and protect her until the deal was complete. There were no details about her past, no information about why she needed protection, just that it was a high-paying job. That was enough for Jackson. He arrived at the drop-off point to find Aurora waiting, standing with her back to him. Her long dark hair fell in soft waves down her back, and her presence seemed to fill the empty space around her. Jackson didn't know why, but something about her felt different. He brushed the feeling aside and approached her with the same cold detachment he used with everyone. "Miss Calloway?" Jackson's voice was rough, like gravel being ground underfoot. Aurora turned to face him, and for a moment their eyes met. The intensity of her gaze caught him off guard. It was as if she could see right through him, peeling back the layers of his tough exterior. "I'm Jackson Creed. I've been hired to escort you to Glissar," he said, his voice almost dismissive. Aurora nodded but didn't speak. She seemed calm, almost too calm, as though nothing in the universe could rattle her. Jackson had dealt with many people in his time, men, women, criminals, politicians, but he'd never met anyone like her. There was a certain energy about her, something he couldn't quite understand. She spoke softly, her voice smooth and melodic. "Let's get this over with, then." The trip to Glissar wasn't an easy one. The journey took them through unforgiving terrain, across dangerous deserts and rocky mountains, with the occasional band of raiders trying their luck at ambushing travelers. Jackson handled them easily. After all, he was a professional. But every time he looked at Aurora, he found himself wondering why she was so calm, so unafraid. She wasn't like the other people Jackson had met. She didn't cower in fear or beg for mercy. She didn't scream when danger was near. Instead, she simply waited. And with every passing hour, Jackson felt more and more intrigued, despite himself. The turning point came one evening when they camped by a deep canyon. The stars above were bright, but the wind was cold. Jackson sat near the fire, sharpening his blade, when he noticed Aurora standing a few feet away, staring into the vastness of the night. Her eyes were fixed on something far beyond the horizon, something Jackson couldn't see. "Something out there?" he asked, his voice gruff as usual. Aurora didn't turn to look at him. She simply nodded as though she had expected the question. "You don't see it, do you?" Jackson frowned, rising to his feet. "See what?" "The truth of things," she replied quietly. "The way everything is connected. The way people and places have their purpose, whether they know it or not." Jackson didn't know what she was talking about. He didn't care about truth or connections. All he cared about was getting to Glissar, completing the job, and getting paid. He had no time for strange philosophical musings from a woman who was clearly hiding something. "You talk too much," he muttered, turning back to his knife. Aurora's lips curled into a faint smile, but she didn't reply. Over the next few days, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They encountered more raiders, but each time Aurora seemed to react differently than he expected. While Jackson would be preparing to fight, she would step forward, her eyes glowing faintly with an almost unnatural calmness, and the raiders would hesitate. Some even backed away as if they were afraid of her, though she had done nothing to threaten them. Jackson found himself growing increasingly frustrated. "What's with you?" He snapped at her one night after they narrowly escaped an ambush. "You think you're some kind of sorceress or something?" Aurora only looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "You think you can control everything, Jackson, but you can't. Not here. Not with me." Jackson had no idea what she was talking about, and he didn't care. "I don't need your help. I'm the one getting us out of trouble, not you." Aurora's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a quiet sadness that Jackson couldn't quite place. "You don't understand yet," she whispered almost to herself. The next morning, as they neared their destination, Jackson's frustration reached a boiling point. He had seen enough of her quiet, mystical power. He wasn't sure how or why it worked, but he didn't like it. "You're my wife, yet mean nothing to me," he snapped, barely containing his irritation as they packed their gear. "You're a liability, just another part of the job. Once we reach Glissar, this ends." Aurora looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You think that's all this is? Just a job?" Jackson turned away. "What else is there?" For a moment, silence hung between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, things neither of them was ready to say. As they approached the edge of Glissar, Jackson felt a strange weight settle on his chest. He had spent years shutting out emotions, keeping people at arm's length. He didn't need anyone, not Aurora, not anybody. But something about her, something in the way she looked at him, the way she made him feel, was different. He didn't know if he liked it or hated it, but he couldn't deny it. When they finally arrived at the outskirts of Glissar, the last thing Jackson expected happened. Aurora, who had been so distant, so cold, stepped toward him, her eyes full of something Jackson couldn't understand, something deep and meaningful. She spoke softly, her words carrying weight. "You don't know it yet, but your life is connected to mine in ways you can't begin to understand." Jackson's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly pushed the feeling aside. "I don't have time for this," he said, brushing past her as he moved toward the city gates. But as he glanced back at her, something in her eyes stopped him. For the first time, Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. Something was coming, something neither of them could avoid. As Jackson walked toward the gates of Glissar, the weight of the city's towering walls seemed to press down on him. He had always been a man of the frontier, someone who preferred the open sky, the harsh wilderness, and the freedom to do as he pleased. This city, with its gleaming spires and bustling crowds, felt like a cage. Yet as he glanced back at Aurora, standing a few paces behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had brushed off her words earlier, dismissing them as the ramblings of a woman who had too many mysteries wrapped around her. But as he walked through the gates, that strange unease he had been carrying since their journey began grew heavier. Aurora followed him quietly, her gaze never leaving him. She hadn't spoken since they arrived at Glissar, but Jackson could feel her eyes on him, piercing through the walls he had built around himself. It was a discomforting feeling, like he was being seen for the first time, truly seen. The city around them was alive with activity, but it seemed as if everyone knew exactly who they were. Jackson noticed the way people watched them, their eyes lingering a bit too long on Aurora. It made him uncomfortable. She was too calm, too poised, like she belonged in a world much grander than this one. They arrived at a large building, a fortress disguised as a palace, where they were supposed to meet the contact who would finish their transaction. Jackson didn't know what exactly Aurora was here for, and she hadn't given him any details. But he didn't care. All that mattered was the job. The building's entrance was guarded by heavily armed men. As they approached, Jackson stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon, ready to assert control. But as he reached for his sidearm, he felt a sudden, strange pulse of energy from behind him. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something that seemed to emanate from Aurora. He turned to see her standing still, her eyes closed as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Her body was tense as though she were gathering all the energy in the air around them. "Everything okay?" Jackson asked, his voice sharp with impatience. Aurora's eyes opened slowly. She didn't respond with words, but instead she reached out her hand, not toward Jackson, but toward the entrance. The guards, who had been watching them closely, suddenly froze. Their weapons lowered, their bodies stiffened as though some invisible force had controlled them. Jackson watched, stunned, as the guards turned and stepped aside without a word. The door to the building opened slowly, revealing a grand hall beyond. He blinked in disbelief. Whatever power Aurora had, it was far more than he had realized. And it was dangerous. "You didn't tell me you were capable of that," Jackson said quietly as they walked past the guards. Aurora didn't look at him. "There is much you don't know about me," she replied softly, "and much you may never understand." As they entered the hall, Jackson's instincts told him something wasn't right. The air felt too still, the shadows too thick. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. They were led down a long corridor and into a meeting room where their contact, a middle-aged man with sharp features and cold eyes, waited. He was seated at a large table, surrounded by several others who looked more like soldiers than businessmen. "Jackson Creed," the man said, his voice smooth. "And you must be Aurora Calloway." His gaze flicked over her with a sharp intensity that sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. "What's going on here?" Jackson asked, his tone already turning suspicious. The man smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "You are the last piece of the puzzle, Mr. Creed, and she," he motioned toward Aurora, "is the key." Jackson frowned, his hand instinctively going to the grip of his gun, but he didn't draw it. "Key to what?" The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The Seraphim." Aurora's face didn't change, but Jackson could feel the sudden shift in the air around her. It was as if a storm was rising within her. The room felt charged, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jackson said, his mind racing. The Seraphim were nothing but legends, ancient stories about an alien race who had once ruled the galaxy before mysteriously disappearing. People said they were gods capable of bending reality itself. "Oh, but you will, Mr. Creed," the man continued. "Aurora Calloway is no ordinary woman. She is the last descendant of the Seraphim, and she will lead us to their power." Jackson glanced at Aurora. Her face was still calm, but he could see the faintest flicker of something, fear, anger. She didn't say a word. "You're wrong," Aurora finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "I've never wanted anything to do with them." The man chuckled softly. "It doesn't matter what you want. You are Seraphim. Your blood runs through their veins, and we'll use you to bring them back." Jackson could see the trap closing around them. This wasn't just about some simple job. This was far bigger than anything he had imagined. "You won't get away with this," Jackson said, his voice growing harder. But the man just smiled again, his eyes gleaming with something darker. "We already have." At that moment, the doors slammed shut and the guards outside rushed into the room, weapons raised. Jackson reached for his gun, but before he could draw, a wave of energy surged through the room. Aurora's eyes glowed faintly and the air seemed to crackle with power. The guards froze mid-step, their faces twisted in fear. They couldn't move. They couldn't breathe. The energy in the room was suffocating, and Jackson could see the truth in Aurora's eyes now. She wasn't just some woman he had been hired to protect. She was something far more dangerous. "I've told you," she whispered. "You don't understand me. But now you will." With a flick of her hand, the guards collapsed to the ground unconscious. The man at the table gasped, backing away in terror as Aurora turned toward him, her gaze colder than any weapon Jackson had ever seen. "You think you can control me?" Aurora's voice was low, threatening. "You think you can use me for your gain? I am not your weapon," the man stammered, his face pale. Please. You don't understand." But before he could say more, Aurora stepped forward, her eyes blazing with power. Jackson felt the air shift around them as she used the full extent of her abilities. The man fell silent, his body trembling. "You've made a mistake," Aurora said softly, her voice calm now as though she were speaking to a child. "And you'll regret it." Jackson watched in awe as the power in the room intensified. He realized with a shock that everything he had ever thought about Aurora was wrong. She was not some helpless woman he had been hired to protect. She was the key to something far greater and far more dangerous. And as he looked at her, he understood. He wasn't just here for the job anymore. He was here because he couldn't leave her, no matter the cost.